am Larkin Eggleston, the chair. As usual, we have got a lot to cover in 2 hours today, so we will get started quickly. I know that Ms. Watlington is on the call, but might or might not be able to speak yet. She's pulling double duty, representing us at a state level committee this morning as well. So she is wearing 2 hats, and I think Ms. Ajmera will be joining us a few minutes late. But I'll start with my vice chair, work around the folks that are here in the room, and then have other committee members, other council members, city staff who are on the call, and guests who are on the call in that order.
James Mitchell. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Hi, Donata Jackson, Office of Constituent Services.
Marcus Jones, City Manager.
Johnny Jennings, Chief of Police.
Patrick Baker, City Attorney.
Federico Rios, Office of Equity, Mobility, and Immigrant Integration.
Maureen Harris, Strategy and Budget.
Ms. Johnson?
A. Johnson, City Council Committee Member.
Other council members joining us on the call?
Braxton Winston, Council Member at Large.
Julie Eisel, Mayor Pro Tem and at Large.
Other city staff joining us on the call?
Good morning, Jessica Battle, lead city attorney over at the police department.
All right. And other guests joining us on the call, some of whom are from our community input group.
Don Thomas, Executive Director of My Brother's Keeper, Charlotte Mecklenburg.
Michael Turner, Department of Criminal Justice, UNC Charlotte.
Speak now or forever hold your peace. All right. Thank you, everybody, for being on the call. And we will jump right in with an overview of our agenda from City Manager Marcus Jones, and then an overview from Federico Rios, as well as some of the members of our community input group, recapping the discussions they had at their most recent meeting last week. Mr. Jones?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Mr. Vice Chair, and members of the committee. So I'll go over the agenda for today. I want to start off by thanking the staff for providing some feedback, the answers to the questions that were posed at the last committee meeting, and those were sent out to the council members yesterday. So we'll have Federico. We didn't think we would have you today, Federico. It's good to have you. And I don't know if you're going to tag team with Lacey to do a review of the community input group. And again, thank you for all the members of the community that have been assisting the committee with this. We'll also have a continued review of the rules of conduct, which Federico will handle that. Additional continued review of the youth programming. And then we will have Chief Jennings and his team start off today for the first time the review of the CMPD directives on passive protests, peaceful demonstrations, and First Amendment activities. Then we'll have a discussion of the next steps. I think what's important is that as we continue on, we will have the topic report outs from the community input groups, as well as an update on the alignment for Aid Can't Wait. I will tell you, I will stand in for the chief for a second, is that normally we would have had that back this week, but we didn't want to put it on here because we haven't made the progress on the last couple that we'd like to. We had a little event last week that occupied a lot of our time. Then we will have continued discussions on the items for today, as well as, for the first time, begin the review of police transparency and access to information. So, Mr. Chair, I would like to just add, one other thing that puts a more global perspective on what's happening. So, in your frequently asked questions and in the questions from the last committee meeting, we used our peer city review much like we do for any item that's related to public safety. There are 20 cities that our economist has used over the course of the last couple of years, and that helped us with pay considerations, even reviewing Aid Can't Wait, and the police services oversight and outreach, which is a part of your package that you received yesterday. But I also want to make sure the community understands that the work is just not being done in this committee. During the month of August and September, all of the council committees have additional areas that we believe can help us in this area of violence reduction and reimagining police, everything from budget and effectiveness to great neighborhoods. And we do have 3 items also for this committee that we're working through, and for the most part, it deals with this advanced holistic approach to violence prevention, what core services accomplish CMPD's mission, as well as a data review on what policy changes are needed. So continuously, you will be getting information from staff. And Mr. Chair, I do want to just end with this point, that as we talk about that holistic approach, we do have Cure Violence that is here. We had our first meeting on August 31st, so the assessment is happening within the community. So I know that we started off in this room maybe a month ago talking about starting this in the fall. Fortunately, we were able to start in August. So the boots are on the ground. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll turn it back over to you.
How frequently can the committee or the council, and thereby the community, expect updates on the Cure Violence information collecting that's going on, and then the actions that'll be taken from that information?
We will do that in each committee, each meeting of this committee, as well as at each strategy session. So even next Tuesday, you'll get an update for the full body.
Could we have somebody from the Cure Violence group come and maybe just at the beginning now give a kind of a reminder and an overview of exactly what it is that they're doing and what we can expect as the outcomes from that?
We will get our key contact for the city is Sarah Hazel, and let's see if we can get that individual on a WebEx for next Tuesday.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Rios, if you would like to give us an update on the most recent community input group gathering.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the opportunity, Chair, Vice Chair, Mr. Manager, and staff. I'm going to go as quickly as I can through our presentation from this past week. So as you'll see in the agenda, we began our discussion on peaceful protests. Group 4 has begun putting together their subgroup analysis. Given the complexity and gravity of this discussion, we want to afford them the time to put together a robust analysis. And so that's why you see that, as the manager alluded to, we will be discussing that at the next Safe Communities Committee meeting and not today. But I did want to give an overview of the presenter, what he had to share, and the meeting itself. And so we began with our breakout sessions. We afforded everyone the opportunity to work on their subgroup analyses and also discuss other topics that have arisen in the community over the course of the last 2 weeks. After that was over, we had Samuel Markison, who is a professor of law at the University of Louisville, present regarding constitutional law. And so to give you a brief on Mr. Markison, he's a graduate from the Yale School of Law, helped to design and conduct the EOC's training program for its employees after enactment of the Americans with Disability Act before it went into effect in 1992. His research and writing has concentrated on constitutional law. He served on the coordinating committee of the Fairness Campaign, Louisville's longstanding LGBT civil rights organization. He also has served on the Kentucky State Advisory Committee for the United States Commission on Civil Rights. And Professor Markison teaches constitutional law, sexual orientation in the law, employment discrimination, and criminal law. And so we were incredibly lucky and blessed to have an individual with such a robust resume to present on his expertise, which is constitutional law. And so we began our discussion around protest and First Amendment rights. In that presentation, Mr. Markison talked about ways in which the First Amendment plays out when it comes to protests, when it comes to the authority of state and local governments to deal and react to said protests, what governments ought to do to be consistent with First Amendment values as distinct to what the First Amendment may require them to do. These are two very different things Mr. Markison shared and should inform any conversation about the proper response to a protest movement. A huge chunk of the First Amendment is about, in whole or in part, protest activity. Not directly implicated are the religion and free press clauses. First Amendment protests the right to freedom of speech, protects the rights of freedom of assembly, and protects the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. This is what protesters are in fact doing. Any restrictions on protests through laws passed or enforcement by police can be challenged as infringement of these rights. It's important to know that the government can enact reasonable restrictions on public protest. These restrictions must be consistent with what the Supreme Court calls time, place, and manner restrictions. Those regulations are based on concerns like where and how protests take place, i.e. permit requirements, and must be acted in a content-neutral way. This was a focal point of the discussion, the fact that things must be content-neutral. The government can regulate conduct, but that is distinct from expression. If the government isn't enforcing a particular law and all of a sudden they start enforcing it against protesters, that will give rise to a First Amendment challenge. The Constitution both expresses rules and principles or values. What values the First Amendment seeks to protect? The values when it comes to protest and free speech is what we want to create a society in which there can be a robust exchange of ideas and that the government is answerable to the people and must listen to the message the people are trying to deliver. There's an affirmative obligation on the government, not just in law, but in good governance, to have systems and policies in place to go above and beyond in permitting and encouraging free speech. The First Amendment also encourages that anyone thinking about these issues is not only how do we avoid violating, but how do we honor its underlying values. We did have a question and answer period with Mr. Markison. At that point, the following questions were asked. What's your view on protecting both the person that had the permit and the counter protester? Mr. Markison shared that it depends very much on documenting what we see, if we have video and evidence that shows the differences. We also received a question about when you have officers that engage in egregious acts. Mr. Markison shared that if police are escalators, that's a First Amendment issue. It's also a criminal justice reform issue. It's also how do we change policing practices issue. Until we change how police do their job, who we're entrusting with the authority to be police officers, and how we discipline for their violations, then this problem is going to continue occurring. This has First Amendment implications, but it's more about public policy. Another question that was asked is, can you extrapolate on the content of the word peaceably? This, again, came up multiple times in the discussion, and someone asked for a more detailed definition of that word. The government has the authority to respond to non-peaceful protests, Mr. Markison shared. There's no constitutional right to non-peaceable assembly or violent assembly. Unfortunately, there is a tradition in this country to not always take protests seriously when it's peaceful. Sometimes you need both to get the attention of America, the professor shared. Those who engage in violence have to be willing to accept the certainty that the system will respond to them with great force. One of the individuals in the group also asked, how could a successful protest be led? Again, asking for best practices around protests. Mr. Markison shared that to make sure that protests had legal observers, people who are apart from the protest but available to document everything that happens, to try to use whatever connections you have with the powers that be in order to establish beforehand a line of communication. This was, again, a focal point in this discussion, this idea that having a discussion prior to the protest with police and other officials would be beneficial to those individuals that are conducting the protest. Both of these are limited solutions, he shared. Until we change training and discipline police have, until there are real consequences for police, any steps taken will have limited success. Again, another question that was asked was, have you seen a department with similar demographics as Charlotte that's getting it right when it comes to protests? He has shared that he has heard stories but can't link them to particular places. Police have a job to do, but if they show that they are at least sympathetic to the concerns of protesters, that goes a long way to de-escalate. One of the biggest problems is that there aren't enough consequences for misconduct, he shared. If we want to prompt police, two more questions. If we want to prompt police officers to do what they need to do when it comes to duty to intervene, how do we frame having civil rights lawsuits tied to police pension funds? Mr. Markison shared that some argue we ought to compensate them better and tie that to better standards. In places where there are adequate pensions, that may be a place to turn. There's a problem using whatever source you go to for finding the money to give a plaintiff. You still have to get through qualified immunity. Cities indemnify their officers until you have a tort system for constitutional violations that makes the officers feel some of the pain there will not be a remedy to deal with the problem. The last question that was asked was, so far this is about police misbehaving during police protests. We need more clarity on where there should be around protests and that there should not be obstruction of traffic or disorderly conduct. This is occurring and police are obligated to respond. What are we saying when it's clear in the law that they just take over the street? Is this group about saying all the protesters are doing everything right? How do we find that balance? Mr. Markison stated that there must be a balance and not everything the government can do is permissible under the Constitution. It's things they ought to do. Encouraging protest and not reacting in a way that shuts it down ends up benefiting the entire community. That was Mr. Markison's presentation in reference to peaceful protests. And again, we're at the beginning stage of a complex discussion around this particular topic, and we are affording our, not only Group 4, but the entire community input group the opportunity to share their feelings around this and their policy recommendations to the group. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rios. Before we go to the continued review of CMPD rules of conduct with recommendations from the community input group, I did want to acknowledge that Councilwoman Ajmera, a member of the committee, is on with us now, as is Councilmember Graham. So with that, Mr. Rios, who is going to lead us through the discussion around the CMPD rules of conduct?
One of the members of Group 2, Dr. Michael Turner, who's the professor and chair of UNCC's Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology. Dr. Turner.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, good morning. Okay, so great. So I was on the subgroup along with Robert Dawkins, Cindy Decker, Rodney McGill to look at the rules of conduct and take a close look at what is going on with CMPD's rules of conduct and to understand them a little bit better in terms of providing clarity both to officers as well as clarity to the public. And you all have this, I believe, the discussion notes in front of you. I'll just kind of roll down through some of the more important pieces that I felt like we mentioned. Policy number 11 talks about the intervention policy with regards to officers will not interfere or take action in cases being handled by other officers unless, and then the point that we're concerned about is the intervening officer believes that a manifest injustice would result from failure to take immediate action. We all strongly felt that the word manifest injustice was relatively vague. It questions the line, whether there's a line between insubordination and accountability. We would like to see more clarity on the manifest injustice comment, and particularly what that means to an officer who is making decisions in a very fast pace. A couple of the other issues were the association's policy. We felt that it does preclude officers from intervening or associating with individuals with criminal backgrounds. However, it doesn't define, and it could go a little further, providing definition of getting or preventing officers from engaging in hate groups. Department of Justice has a list of hate groups that is very clearly articulated, and these are individuals who perhaps may not have criminal backgrounds, but those individuals breed hate, and the extent to which CMPD perhaps might be dealing with the arbitrary profile. How are they handling some of these issues? There was also a discussion with regards to policy number 43 with regards to the commitment. Talks a lot about body-worn cameras, and the group felt that there needs to be a policy that indicates that the video needs to stay on, and that there are penalties for it being turned off. And again, perhaps CMPD has this, so we're unaware, but it doesn't say that in the policy's code of conduct here. So it needs to stay on at all times when interacting with public. There's a policy number 42 that talks about the violation of any of these rules, yet there are no consequences that are articulated in terms of whether an individual or a set of officers violate the rules. We understand there are probably there are personnel issues with regards to that, and I to be honest, I don't know CMPD's policy on what personnel issues are available to the public and what are not, but it would behoove the group if the public had a more transparent view on the escalation of those consequences and in specific cases. And one of the last things, and I'll scroll back up again, but in the code of conduct, there's lots of discussion about fitness for duty. And while much of this is thought of as physical fitness, it's really a mental fitness as well. There are several mental health considerations that need to be considered, particularly in the day-to-day activities of officers' jobs and what they're faced with on a daily basis. This needs to be articulated with the group felt that needs to be articulated in the policies and procedures. The officers should not be held back or discriminated against for seeking mental health support. We need to encourage that, not to punish that, and provide individuals with screenings and as much support as we can as they do their daily job. And then the last one up above, which is abuse of power. And again, it's pretty self-explanatory in terms of the policy, but what we're concerned about is the mandatory reporting or promotions. We'd like to have more information, again, more transparency